You will be better at job interviews by the time you finish this video. That's the hook, that's the reason to keep watching. There are 4 stories that you need to be able to tell to do well in job interviews, and you are going to be asked them over and over again. Knowing those stories inside and out and being able to tell them well is going to help you answer nearly every behavioral-based interview question you can get. The first story is your most successful project in your career. Think back to a project that went really well for you and be able to talk through the project's challenges and context behind them. Can you emphasize the actions you took to overcome the obstacle? And is the impact it had on the company or the project or whoever was affected clear when you tell this story? Now, this question can come in a couple different ways. One is as simple as, what's the most successful project you've ever had in your career? And you know how to answer that. But you may hear something like, tell me about a time you demonstrated leadership skills on a project. And it will probably come from this story. Or describe a situation where you had to overcome multiple obstacles or work within a tight deadline. And that can come from this story. Tell me about a time you took initiative to drive a big change within a company. And that can come from this story. Knowing your most successful story is going to answer a ton of questions on your job interview. A lot of people will push back here and say, I don't really have a big success, or the work I do didn't matter. But it mattered to somebody. You've done something well in your career, and think about how it affected the people that it mattered to. And the second big story that is really important that will constantly come up is your least successful project, the opposite of the first story. I know a lot of people think talking about failure is some kind of trap, but it is not a trap. People are not perfect at work, and companies know this. In fact, the only trap when it comes to this question is pretending you're perfect in your career when they know that you are not. Being transparent about a tough project is a few things. It demonstrates self-awareness, it demonstrates the ability to learn, and it demonstrates the ability to reflect back on things that have happened in your career. Some of the questions you may get for this beyond just tell me about a time you failed are, tell me about a time you had to handle a setback. Or tell me how you handle setbacks. Tell me about a time you had to pivot on a project because it wasn't working. How do you recover and what do you do after you fail? Tell me about a situation where you had to take responsibility for a mistake that you made. Tell me about a situation where you were given responsibility for a mistake you didn't make. Tell me about a time you realized a project was not on track to get where it needed to be and what you did. Tell me about a project where you didn't get clear objectives or were getting conflicting information about what you should be doing and what happened because of it. Interviewers really appreciate people who learn from their mistakes. Showing resiliency and adaptability is a really big part of landing a job. I have seen these 4 stories help so many people on interviews in their career who come back to me over and over again and say this is the most helpful piece of advice I've ever given them. I turned these 4 stories into a downloadable ebook so that people could really dig in and understand and practice and put these stories together for themselves. It's one thing to talk about it or see it in a video form, but it's different to really sit down and start to prepare these stories and know how to tell them well. And this book allows me to dig in a lot further than I can go to when I just talk about it. The reason I really love these 4 stories is because they have the ability to be retold over and over again in different situations during an interview. I like to think of these stories almost like a tree branch. You have your one big story that comes off of the tree. Each smaller branch coming off of that large branch is a different part of the story based on the question you got, how you handled a different situation, or what happened. When you know that main branch story really well, you are able to tell all these other offshoots at different parts of the interview. You can even reference it sometime. You know, I mentioned this story earlier where I talked about this project that went really well. And one of the reasons it went really well is because I overcame this challenge specifically. The third story could be multiple stories. It's what I call your most difficult stakeholders. Now, a stakeholder could be anybody. A stakeholder could be your boss. A stakeholder could be an owner of a company. It could be a coworker. It could be a customer. It could be a client. So you may need multiple stories of different types of stakeholders depending on what you do. If you need to define a stakeholder, think of it as anybody with a vested interest in the outcome of what's going on. The way you deal with a difficult customer is going to be different than the way you deal with a difficult boss, and that's why it may be important to prepare more than one. A couple things that are really being looked for in a question like this is how you handle disagreement, is how you handle things where you don't really have control of what the result's going to be. Conflict resolution is a really important skill in the workplace, and it's not a red flag for a company to say conflict happens here, because conflict happens everywhere. The other piece of advice I would say for this story is to understand that when I talk about conflict or difficulty, it doesn't have to be a big dramatic thing. A lot of people push back on this and they will say that they've never really had conflict. They don't really care what happens at work. They just let people get away and do whatever. But there are still disagreements. There are still times you thought something was different. Instead of trying to think of the biggest story you can find where there was this huge blowout and then this big result from it, just think of a time where you would have done it differently or how you handled a situation where someone was being more difficult than you wanted them to be. Some examples of how you're going to see this story come up. Can you share a time that you received pushback on your work that you thought was good? Can you think of a time that you had to share sensitive information with a coworker? Can you think of a time that you were working with somebody who was difficult and not receptive to a change that had to happen? How did you gain buy-in from somebody in that situation? How did you find common ground with somebody you had a disagreement with? Tell me about a time you disagreed with somebody who was above you but knew that you couldn't change the result even though you knew you were correct. This is a great opportunity on an interview to demonstrate emotional intelligence. The key is how you solve these problems professionally and move forward. Not that you won, or not that you solved the situation perfectly. Before I get into this story, I do want to remind you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and follow me on other social media, and all those things I'm supposed to plug when I make videos. I also have a brand new website coming soon. This website is going to be a great combination of a lot of things, information for job seekers, as well as information for companies on how to improve hiring. The site is set to launch this month. Right now I have a box available to receive updates for when the site and some of these projects are live. I would definitely appreciate you going there and signing up so that I can stay in contact with you in those situations. I am not looking to send spam to a lot of people, I promise. The fourth story you really need to know for an interview is what I call your passion project. And sometimes people get confused by this one or they don't love the title of it. The truth is that one of the best things a candidate can do during an interview is have that moment where their eyes light up and you can tell that they really love what they are talking about. I understand that might be cringe for a lot of people, the idea of loving what you're doing at work, but I do think most people with a good professional career have things they like about what they're doing. This story is your chance to showcase any enthusiasm you have for the type of work that you do, which is something a lot of hiring managers are looking for. And a passion project is a great way to show that off. Some of the questions you may get in a job interview are something like, if you could do anything in this industry, what would it be? Or what is the ideal next role for you? What would you be working on? What are you most proud of so far in your career? What do you find most rewarding about what you do? Can you talk about a specific time where you took great pride in what you accomplished on a project? This may be the hardest of the four stories for some people to come up with, and it is going to be the one that maybe gets asked about the least of these four, but there are a lot of ways that a question like this can come up, especially the question about what's the ideal next role for you. Remember with these stories that it is not about memorizing a script. The reason you want to know these stories well and practice telling them is so that you can be a great storyteller. Yes, storytelling and being a great storyteller is a big part of the interview process. You might hate that. I can't change it. You can't change it. That is what it is when it comes to interviewing. So the best you can do is prepare for that. When you know these stories well, you are comfortable telling them, you know the high points, you know the parts that maybe you can leave out next time, and you will start to remember the little details that are really important to include each time you tell the story. You're also going to benefit from the confidence that comes with knowing the stories you're going to tell really well. A key to job interview success is preparation and confidence, and knowing these stories in advance is going to take care of those things. So get started, think about these stories, and be ready to tell them on future interviews. Let me know down in the comments what you think about these stories. If they're helpful, don't forget to check out the ebook, follow me along on social media, and I'll see you next Thursday for a new video.